Mental Maps is brought to you by Aruka Well. Aruka Well is a virtual holistic mental health service providing psychiatric evaluations, holistic interventions, and when needed, medication management. For more information, check out Aruka Well at www.arukawell.co. That's www.arukahwell.co. Welcome back to Mental Maps. As always, I hope this finds you well no matter what season of life you're in. Today I'm joined by Jane Hahn and Hannah Buzzo, two therapists who are operating throughout some of the mountain towns of Colorado, who are going to be talking today about all the concepts that go along with mental health in these interesting places. Hannah, Jane, welcome.
Thanks for
Thank
having us.
you.
Awesome. So I was recently out in Keystone traveling and snowboarding, or attempting to snowboard rather, and kind of learning about all the interesting concepts that is Colorado and mental health, right? And so Colorado has quickly became just an epicenter for mental health treatment and awareness, and a lot of the work that not only people like you are doing, but even like politically that's going on out there. And so within that, there's also some really interesting concepts that go into Colorado mental health, because it's a different kind of place, right? Now, there's other places like this in the world, but here in Florida, it's very different. And so, what would you guys say makes Colorado such a prime place for mental health and the awareness of mental health?
I think Colorado just has such an interesting history, especially because weed was legalized here so early. And I think that people associate it with sort of this like forward, like it's just a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of like medicines and things like that. So I
Mm,
think that's one piece, and I'm sure we'll get
mm,
into psychedelic medicine.
mhm.
But I think sort of being on the forefront of the marijuana train kind of laid the groundwork for the psychedelic medicine that's happening now. But I don't know. I think it's just an interesting. It's a pretty liberal and open-minded place. So there's lots of people who are interested in mental health.
Mhm.
There's lots of people who are interested in like Hannah and I have trouble with the word wellness because it's sort of everywhere, and means
Mhm.
nothing now. But
Yeah.
it's sort of a hub for people who are interested in like the outdoors and a healthy lifestyle. And for some people, they tie therapy into that.
Mhm.
Um, what would you add to that, Hannah?
Well, I think you're right on. And I think on the sadder part of things, people come from all over the world to ski and live and explore Colorado, especially the mountain town where you were at, Josh, which is also where Jane and I both have our own individual practices. And the sad reality is people come like seeking this dream to be living out in the mountains, to be skiing all the time. And unfortunately, our beautiful mountain towns are just that, very beautiful, but also there aren't a lot of mental health resources. It's cold and snowy and isolative for a lot of the time. It's expensive. So people have a hard time forming community. They move in and out of the mountain towns. Addiction and substance use is also really prevalent. So I think, yes, the psychedelic space and being more progressive and having more modalities to use. But I also think a lot of people come to Colorado, especially our mountain towns, seeking this certain sort of lifestyle. But then unfortunately, mental health will find them there too. And resources are limited, especially in those smaller towns.
Right on. So not only do you find like that there's this political climate that kind of opens the door, and there's this awareness, but then also people kind of find they become unwell. Not, well, let's say unwell. Their minds become unwell a little bit easier, right? Just because of some of the things. So what do you feel like, especially like in those mountain towns, right? I know Brett Repkin uh, directed the movie Paradise Paradox. I don't guys, have you guys seen that? And that was just
Mhm.
an incredible awareness outdoor film of just how you're in these mountain towns, but then wherever you go, there you are, right? And so all your stuff kind of comes up. What do you feel like are some of like the biggest challenges for people who are already there, right? Not the transplants moving in, but people who are kind of living day in and day out for years and years up there. What are kind of the main challenges you see for them?
Well, one, especially for my clients that have lived full time in the area for many years, they're being priced out.
Mm,
So locals that have been in the communities, especially hotspots like Breckenridge, Summit County, Aspen, Vale, all of those areas have become a hub for tourism, which is great, but also, you know, have become a hub for Airbnbs and second home ownership. So prices have just skyrocketed. Housing is a big, big, big issue for my clients. So finding reliable, safe housing that's even semi-affordable is very difficult. And we know if someone has a hard time finding safe and reliable housing, kind of everything else will have an impact on that too. So I definitely think it's the housing piece. And then also, you know, if you are there for a while and you do establish a community and your community is getting priced out, or, you know, I just had a client have her best friend have to move because she had a baby and she can't afford it. There's no childcare. So you're really using that community too when you're in such a expensive, like seasonal place to live. People can just kind of turn and move on more quickly, I think.
Man. You know, and it's so interesting because I live in a traveler town as well. It's a little bit different, but you've kind of seen that happen here, right? All these people moved, especially like post-pandemic, everybody kind of was headed to Florida and other places. And so we've seen like a lot of people kind of get outpriced of living here, or there's kind of a struggle. And then what do you think? Because I know what I've seen, but just for the listeners too, I think there's so many different concepts that come with that gentrification of like an area, right? Like you see like substance use occur, you see uptick of suicide, you see uptick of like bullying in schools. I mean, it's just kind of changing. What do you guys see there kind of upticking for people as they're trying to navigate this world?
I think definitely. Well, uh, Summit County in particular, again, which is Breckenridge and
Yeah.
Silverthorne and Dillon, all those places,
Yeah.
I think historically has always had some issues with substance abuse, but I think we're seeing different kinds of drugs come through, and then you see sort of like um, drugs that hadn't maybe substances that maybe hadn't made their way through the town until more money came through the town and they're more accessible. So people are talking about seeing it in show up in with the youth and show up with the locals and show up in the service industry. So I think that can be really tricky. Um, I think that we saw a big uptick recently actually in eating disorders with
Really?
the youth up there. Some I don't know how your town is, but sometimes these like adventure based tourism towns can have a really heavy focus on your body, how your body works, how your body sort of conquers the mountain and how your body adventures. And often that can equate for people of all genders and all ages to, you know, slim and muscular. So I think that can be a big struggle for people up there.
Huh. It's
Mhm.
really interesting because something my wife and I were talking about as we were kind of navigating through there and just being in Keystone and kind of being on the mountain. You didn't feel like, or at least as someone that's kind of like walking through that world, you didn't feel like the body was such a hot topic because you're so covered up, right? Like you go to like a beach town
Yeah.
here, like you're just walking around in your bikini every day or your swimsuit. And so
Mm,
it's like you're just showing your body constantly. And so because of that, definitely you see people who really struggle with that or they kind of avoid the beach. But it's interesting that you see that even in a town where like you're wearing snow pants and a big
mhm,
coat every day. Huh.
mhm.
That's
And the
really
summer
interesting.
always comes for you. You know, they say like come for the winter,
Yeah.
stay for the summer because it's stunning there. And so then
Right
all the
on,
layers
yeah.
come off, all the layers come off and people are boating and swimming and hiking and trail running and you know, that stuff kind of follows you. Yeah.
Well, and then, like, physical ability too, I would
Yeah.
imagine, right? Because, I
Mhm.
mean, you have a just a certain group of people who can do a lot of those things, but what
Mhm.
happens if you can't do those things?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the piece, I think the performance piece and just the lifestyle piece. We just had an episode come out with on our podcast with this really lovely guy, Dylan Stein, and he had kind of worked up all his 20s through COVID to move to Breckenridge and become this like big mountain skier guy. And
Mhm.
within a few months, I can't remember if he like broke his leg or something, but he was
Mm,
unable to do what he came there for. And so that's how the community is formed. That's why everyone is living there, right? And so
Mhm.
when you can't be a part of that, how isolating is that for folks?
Oh, yeah, man, what that's a great concept because you just don't think about that,
Right.
like, you're just like, "Oh, they're all adventurers, or we're all adventurers kinda running around out there," but, like, what happens when that's because you think it's gonna last forever. It's not like a college athlete where, like, it's sooner or later, it's gonna end, like, ultimately, everything's gonna end at some point, but you think, "Oh, I'm gonna adventure forever," but what happens if you can, or especially if you train to go out there? That's so interesting. So,
mhm.
as you guys kinda navigate this as therapists, like, how are you intervening in this world? Like, what does that look like to help people who are kinda navigate walking through this?
I'm like a no non-athlete. which actually seems to be working to my credit because I can help clients to see that they live in a culture, right? They live in a little bubble and there's lots of great aspects to it and there's some negative and neutral aspects. So I think all of us are fish in the water that we swim, right? So
Mhm.
everything seems normal and real and true. And so I think for a lot of my clients, I'll work with them around like, this isn't how everybody lives, this isn't how everybody thinks. So we can relate to these things differently. We can relate to ourselves differently. We can relate to our self concept differently, um, both in this little bubble that you're in and then the broader culture. I personally do a lot of EMDR and trauma based therapies
Mm,
with my
mm.
clients. We have a psychedelic therapist on staff. We also have an ecotherapist on staff who does, I mean, she skis with her clients, she does hikes with her clients. Um, we're just kind of trying to hit it from all angles,
Yeah, right
personally.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm so lucky, and my practice is so lucky that it is very much based on the psychedelic landscape. So we were actually the first practice to offer psychedelic therapy in Summit County. And it's just growing and expanding, especially as more medicines become more available and accessible. So the thing we've been doing really recently is some really amazing attachment and relationship work with couples using psychedelics. So we're so lucky here to have access to that in our state, because I really don't see how we could be doing the work that we do, especially when it comes to attachment and trauma, without these really powerful medicines.
Right on. And before we jump into the psychedelic stuff, because I know not only do I want to discuss it, but I know all my listeners want to hear about it too. It does sound like trauma kind of has like an overarching umbrella in that world. Do you kind of see that be a big driver in a lot of this?
I
I
think
think
that's
good.
I think that's just my lens for the work
Mm,
that I do. Once I did my EMDR training, I was like, oh, this is now how I operate. This
mm,
is the route. Um, but maybe, specific to our community, certainly there's accidents and there's injuries in that community. But also to what Hannah was talking about before, in these sort of like, I mean, it is a paradise. You were just there, Josh. You could
mm,
attest. It's
mm.
very beautiful.
Yeah.
It's absolutely stunning, you know. And so I think people have a fantasy that, again, like I can go to paradise and get away
Mm,
from everything that's
mm,
hard or everything I've
mm.
been through, everything that I was, and be brand new. And it's almost even more painful to wake up and still feel or still be you and be like, but I live in paradise, shouldn't I be feeling good?
Yeah.
um so I do a lot of that. I certainly do a lot of that work with my clients, like, yes, you are in a beautiful place and your history is still with you.
Yeah.
Mm, yeah. Do you agree with that, Hannah? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point for sure. And I also think it's my lens. I agree with Jane. I think the biggest thing that I see is I think we are a progressive state. And I think the mountain towns, especially Summit County, is liberal and progressive and open minded for the most part. And so I think there's a lot more people here open to therapy.
Mm,
There's like the joke that there are more therapists in Boulder than there are in the whole state of Colorado. So I
oh,
think therapy is accessible here, and
yeah.
therapy is part of the culture. And I think people are a little bit more open about that piece too. So I think, where I'm from West Virginia. When I use the word trauma with my parents, they're like, what the hell is trauma?
Oh, wow.
Mm.
Yeah.
But when we're out here, it's just kind of the language that we use.
Right on. And so, and you guys have kind of spearheaded that, not only doing the work in Summit, but in other counties kind of around there and just creating that awareness, which it's such a need, right? Especially like, growing up in Tennessee, near Appalachia, like West Virginia, all that. I mean, that's a
Mm.
place that, it's not talked about, but it just rips through it, right? It's kind of a mountain
Yeah.
town itself. It is interesting you bring up like the paradise of it. I wrote in my blog how I think there's something very humility driving as you're like standing under those mountains and you kind of realize like how small you actually are as a
Mhm.
human, and like not only that but like that's not man created. Man can get to the top of that, or humans can get to the top of that, but like we didn't create that. And I think it can bring up a lot for people. I know for us, like we got home, like there's kind of a come down from it, right? Like I can go
Mm.
look at the sea all day and that's beautiful, don't get me wrong, I love it, I absolutely love it, but there's something about like waking up and being just like engulfed in like something so much bigger than you. I
Totally.
think, yeah, I think there's something in that.
I've had some clients who, well, I've seen lots of things. some people can really use that to their advantage and are
Mm,
in nature every day. I mean, they walk
yeah.
out in their backyard and they can take a hike or a ski or a skin. A
Mm,
skin for you non-winter athletes, which is myself. I had to learn this from my client, is where you climb up a snowy mountain with your skis, I don't know, strapped to your back, and then you ski down. So you like hike first and then ski down. I know it's like very common in that community. It's very impressive.
right on.
But yeah, they can just, they have access. So I've seen some clients use it in a really profound way. And then I've seen other clients race from experience to experience, like what you're talking about, Josh, of like the awe and wonder.
Mhm,
And then they go back to life. And then it's almost like an addiction. Like, what's the next piece of awe and wonder that I'm going to,
mhm,
now I'm going to Moab. Now I'm camping here. Now I'm skinning or
mm,
skiing here. And, so I think I've had clients talk about that, how that can be tricky for them
mm,
because there's always sort of chasing that high.
mm. Yeah, that's a great one. And how do you like just like for listeners too, like how do you find contentment in that? Like when you experience that world, working with people who do those things, like how do you find contentment day in and day out of just like getting in your car and going to work and that kind of stuff?
Mhm. I mean, I work with my clients a lot on having coping skills that are not just like exercise and nature, because those are
Mm,
amazing coping skills and they're not always accessible. So I will work with clients on like, how do we have a well-rounded toolkit for
mm,
taking care of our mental health? If I can't get out and do the thing, like my first line of defense to take care of myself, what are 7 other things I can do to
mm,
feel good and be well? Um, and then I kind of have I talk a lot with my clients about like they don't all have to be big giant emotions for them to be good and for them to be
mm,
satisfying. Like there's a nuance or a subtlety that can also be really like grounding and heartwarming and connecting, in addition to the big, ups and downs, highs and lows.
mm.
That's what I'm doing in my practice.
I like that. That's nice. You think you like that, Hannah, on that?
Yeah, I agree with Jane. I really think it's just part of being a human and like how do we hold all of it, right? How do you hold the awe? And I mean, I have 2 torn ACLs, so I am no longer a skier. But being at the top of the mountain, these people are like skiing so hard, the most beautiful places in the world. How do you hold that and also like hold like you got to pay your taxes and your bills too, right? So I think it's about being able to hold the capacity of all of those
Mm.
things of the human experience rather than just spending all your time chasing one, right?
Yeah, that's so insightful. And I think in that world, it's so needed to be discussed, right? Because it's all about like what's next, like in the
Mhm.
adventure world or any kind of outdoors world, even in like action sports, it's like what's next, like you do a 900 and then it's like, can I do a 1080? And then can I do it? And I mean, it's just always progressive. So like, what's it like to just kind of be present and be content in that moment with those emotions? Something I'd love to kind of get your all's opinion on and kind of work through is, we were talking about just the social factors of like Colorado and some of these mountain towns, but there's also like the environmental factors, right? And I think there's really two concepts in it. One is like what the environment's going through, and we can kind of, riff on that for a minute. But I would love to talk about just the differences of that elevation, right? I know there's the work that was done at the University of Utah and some of those areas where they're using creatine and other supplementation to kind of create vasodilation and improve oxygenation. What do you guys see in that world? Is that happening? Do you see that kind of be a big difference? And what does that look like?
Jane, you know the stat. I don't have it. I actually learned it from you where it's over a certain elevation. There's only like 3 or 4 in the world, Summit County being one. What is it?
9,000 above 9,000 feet, mental health
Mm,
pretty significantly plummets like across
yeah.
the world. Hmm.
Wow. Okay. And what do you feel like, in your opinion, just kind of working in that is the driver for that?
I think there is a physiological
Mm,
component, right?
Me
Like
too.
there's that, and I am not a doctor or a biologist, so I'm not even going to try to speak to how that works. But I think from the lens where I sit, there's that biological component. But I think what we know is biology also affects culture and human relationships. And so I really do think too, it's isolative. They get a lot of
mm,
snow. They aren't able to just hop in the car and go see their neighbor, right? Or walk across the street. There's a lot more disconnect and a lot more isolation. And I think that definitely plays a role too. long winters. And yes, people are skiing, but it also, there's real science behind seasonal depression. And I think there too, high elevation with lots of snow and really cold weather, that's all a mixture to what I think really impacts mental
Mm.
health.
Yeah. I think you have like the perfect storm, right? Like you got this
Yeah.
social isolation, so you have the social factor, you have the concept with seasonal affective, right? Just the changes in sunlight, not getting a lot of sun, the vitamin D. And then you do have the decrease in oxygen to the frontal lobe and like what that looks like to be just a little bit more impulsive. You're not thinking as clear. What was it? I think there's a stat that there's more suicides between 3,000 and 5,000 feet above sea level than any other place in the world. And so it's like,
Mm.
what is the reason? And so there is a belief that there has to do with this inability to get oxygen there and kind of see it. So it's just a perfect storm for these, for a lot of people who are up there, especially if you're not like used to it or live it. Like I taught a lecture while I was up there, like virtually, and I was like sucking wind by like the
Yeah.
end of it, right? And so I was like, what does it look
Totally.
like to live like this every day? And then you have a bad day, man, like it could be easy to get to those like negative spaces.
Especially if, most people have no family there. So
Yeah.
if you can't get
Mm,
to your family, right? Or you can't get to your friends, or your friends have all moved out of town, or you're also struggling financially, which many folks are,
mm,
or, there's a lot of those issues. We also have a pretty big Hispanic Latin American population up there. There's some language barriers, there's barriers to work, there's barriers to a lot of things for those folks. So I think
yeah.
we're seeing some, and there's some cultural, barriers to therapy and relationships to therapy. So it can be really tricky for a lot of people.
Where do you find like, as a lot of transplants kind of move in or they kind of do that, like what are things that people can do to kind of help them thrive there?
I have found my clients do really well when they have kind of what Jane was saying, a community outside of
Mm,
just like skiing or mountain biking or the bar scene. I've had
mm,
clients be really creative about forming men's groups and dance groups and mindfulness groups and garden groups, right? So I think seeking out community in some ways that perhaps just aren't as easy to get into, and it probably requires some looking around and some creating and getting uncomfortable, but really finding community outside of those big things, I think has been super helpful for the people I work with.
yeah. I- So community, that's what I keep hearing for you guys, like community's so big. Is it
And
really just go ahead.
I think there's like a fantasy that you'll just like hop on the mountain and meet all your people,
Yeah.
So I love, Hannah, the idea of like outside of skiing and outside of the bar scene, having some people that you have some other interests in common with and that you want to be connected with.
Yeah, man. And you just don't think about that, right? Like you just think like it's all going to be, you're just out there in paradise, right? But there's clearly
Hmm.
something about, a community. And I think that's everywhere, right? Like, we talk about it in all kinds of different spaces that community is so important, having like people to bring you up if you're not feeling well and all those things, but more than just about like one interest, right? Like
Yes.
that, and it's always physically driving because it's always not going to be there. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. So Hannah, I know like you're kind of spearheading a lot of this psychedelic work. And so there's a lot of movement happening in Colorado now. And so, can you kind of explain what that looks like? Because I think there's a lot of different discussions out there of what's happening in Colorado and how that's being delivered. So, kind of break that down for us if you can.
Yeah. So, there are different ways that psychedelic medicine has been used and continues to be used. I think the thing that's becoming more hot topic right now is psychedelics for therapeutic reasons. Psychedelics have been used for thousands of years by
Hmm.
indigenous populations and for ceremonial purposes. But what really has come through in the last couple of years in Colorado is this movement towards legalizing psychedelics and using them for therapy and therapeutic use. So there's been some legislation that's passed around personal use of different psychedelic medicines, particularly different plant medicines. And now the regulations are just coming out this year about how they can be used in a therapy setting. And so different therapists, and you don't even have to be a therapist really. There's certain requirements for whatever tier. There can be a facilitator, a therapist, to make the work more accessible for people. But we're following kind of the Oregon the state of Oregon's format. They were the first state to create basically a program for psychedelic therapy, and we're following in their footsteps. So it's rolling out. I think people here have been doing it more underground or more kind of in closed circles, but now it's becoming really where anyone can get access to psychedelics for therapy used in that context.
What does that look like from like a reimbursement perspective? Is like any insurance paying for that anyway? Not like Colorado Medicaid, anything like that?
No, so some insurance will pay for ketamine assisted
Hmm.
psychotherapy or just
Yeah.
ketamine infusions,
Mm.
which we've had some luck with. That's another tricky piece. And if you sit down with someone, in their psychedelic space, like there's people that are definitely pro the regulations, definitely people that are against it. I think one problem that I have, and a lot of my colleagues have, is how expensive it is, right? So there's certain requirements of a natural medicine facilitator. If you go the route to get licensed through the state, there's a lot more expense and regulations around being a natural medicine healing center, which is an actual location. And so they do have certain requirements. And unfortunately, that means often that the costs are really high, both for businesses and providers, but also clients. And we're not quite there with the insurance companies. So that is a barrier that we're definitely crossing and having to navigate.
Right on. And so what plant medicines are you seeing being used the most out in Colorado in that area right now?
Yeah, so I would say psilocybin is the biggest one that I'm seeing therapeutically. There's also some other plant medicines that are being used. Some people in my circle are using medicines like 5-MeO-DMT in their therapy practice. Some are using things like Bufo or Combo in their therapy
Hmm.
practices. But really, the biggest thing that I'm seeing in this space is using psilocybin.
Psilocybin, yeah. And there's some really incredible research on that, right? I know when we were in Costa Rica last year, we got to sit down with a shaman who was doing the Ibogaine and a lot
Mhm.
of Iboga work. And that was just really interesting, the trauma work. And then right at that same time, Stanford had released that study about the work with veterans. And so, there's definitely a movement, not only in academia, but then also in like holistic centers and places to find it. What I love that you were talking about was the use of therapy with it. Can you
Mhm.
speak to that and kind of what that looks like?
Oh, you do not want to get me on this
Oh,
soapbox.
girl, yeah, I
So,
do. That's why you're here.
okay, so I'm a therapist, and again, psychedelic medicines have been used for ceremony and healing and personal use and recreational use. I am all for that. I think the tricky part, and something that we're navigating in our state, especially in the mental health field, is as this explodes, there's more and more interest and there's more and more money in these different realms. And so one thing that we're seeing a lot is, I think, people that don't have training or may have like harmful intentions. Not everyone, but we're definitely seeing an increase in psychedelic related harm.
Mm.
I just heard a story from a client last week that was pretty gnarly about something that they experienced. So because these regulations, and because the state is making certain programs and making you go through certain like requirements that are expensive and time consuming, you can also go the underground route, which is, I'm not going to go through the regulations and the licensing and all that, but I'm just not going to advertise it. And I'm going to use the decriminalization and some of the other language that the law says, where if a client is not paying you for the actual medicine, if it's a gift or if they acquire it on their own, they can use it with you. And so I'm also finding that there are just some loopholes that people are pushing that aren't required, to get training, and I think are doing some harm. And so I think it's a really hard place to be, because I think, on one end, the regulations are great and making it more streamlined, but also creating a lot of barriers for people to access it. On the other hand, because of those barriers, right, there are a lot of people without training. And I think a lot of clients and the public don't really know what therapeutic psychedelics are.
Mm.
Therapeutic psychedelics are where you have a trained facilitator working with you, and the focus is not on the psychedelic experience, that the focus is on the therapeutic work that you're doing. And I think there's just a lot of buttons being pushed in the culture, in the state, around what it really is, because people don't know and they aren't educated about it, right?
Yeah, right on. What do you think is like what what is it that psychedelic opens in your opinion from a therapeutic perspective? Because I was a therapist before I was a nurse practitioner. I still do therapy for people. So like, what is it? Because I have some of my own views on that, but I've never kind of been in that space. What is it that it opens, or what does it do compared to just like your regular talk therapy?
Yeah, so there are a lot of biological different things that happen in the brain, which I won't speak to too much, but something like, glutamate response,
Hmm.
dopamine,
Hmm.
serotonin. So there are a lot of just like neurochemical things that happen with psychedelics, but specifically for therapy. Psychedelics, depending on the one that you do and the therapist's approach and the work that they're doing, that's all important. But at least in the work that I do and that I train other therapists in, is you don't know what you don't know, right? So there's the stuff about like talk therapy is only what you're conscious of, and you can build insight and you can build consciousness, and a good therapist will help you become more insightful about what is driving your behaviors or your thoughts or your patterns. But really, psychedelics kind of take you right there. So they allow folks to really get into the subconscious realm. They allow folks to kind of get perhaps a spiritual or a transpersonal experience that they wouldn't
Hmm.
and just normal waking talk therapy. And also, from a trauma perspective, we know that a corrective experience is the only thing that heals trauma. So you
Hmm.
can't just talk
Hmm.
through trauma. You have to have an experience in your nervous system, in your body, in order to process it. And so psychedelics also allow clients to have those experiences, I think, in a really beautiful and safe way. Again, I think you can achieve a lot of the same things with psychedelic therapy that you could with talk therapy, not all, but I think with psychedelic therapy, it makes the process way less defended for people. So they have way more access to it. They have more pleasure and fun doing it than they would in a talk therapy setting. And I think it opens up people to a lot of different feelings that they wouldn't ordinarily have in
Hmm.
a talk therapy session. That makes it kind of a novelty experience, to be honest.
Right on. I love how you just kind of discuss that, right? Because I know there's such a hot topic, right? Like you can get in the neuro world where we kind of just talk about, the brain drive neurotropic factor and all the neuroplasticity that's occurring and the
Yes.
healing, and then you can get in like a psyche perspective where it's like ego dissolution, and so you're kind of just destroying these defense mechanisms, and then you get in the spiritual world, and it's all kind of a spiritual thing, but it almost sounds like when true healing occurs, it's like an amalgamation of all of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so. And I think what you're talking about with bad characters too is you are seeing parts of the country where people are just getting like one version of it,
Yeah.
right? So
Mm.
they're micro dosing and they're not doing any therapy, or they're going to like they're getting it and like taking it in their mom's basement and then they're having like a psychotic break or something. And like there's all these things that are kind of occurring, but really it's the amalgamation of all three that kind of creates the healing.
Totally, 100%.
Right
And I
on.
think the relationship too, right? This is a real therapist-y thing to say, but I think, I work with a lot of couples having the relationship with me, but also the relationship between the couple when they're working on this psychedelic space. And this psychedelic space is so healing too. So I think it is the spiritual, the physical, the biological, the emotional, and also the relationship, right? Like you being in relationship with someone else while all those effects are taking place, I
Mhm.
think is a game changer.
This may be for both of you because you guys are both entrepreneurial business minds. Like, what does this look like to manage it from a business perspective, right? Like the ability to like to deliver this, to deliver it safely, to do the assessments. What does that look like as a provider?
What do you think, Jane?
I think there's a lot more. You know what I think actually? We're so used to like thinking about ethics already, and thinking about how to responsibly provide care. And so for me, it actually doesn't feel that different.
Mm,
I have one psychedelic therapist on staff, and we don't hold any medicine on site. Now in Colorado,
mm.
that's kind of what Hannah's talking about, as I understand it, Hannah, that they're sort of rolling out these new sort
Yeah.
of trials where you can keep a certain amount of psilocybin on hand.
Okay.
So our clients, they get a ketamine prescription, they self-dose it in session. We don't touch the medicine at all. We're not trained around that.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, Hannah, it's probably going to be the same with psilocybin and some of the other medicines in the healing center world. Um, but I think, and another piece for us is that we had our psychedelic therapist trained. She went through the same training institute that Hannah works with. And so I would never have a therapist do psychedelic work without the training, and the training is still coming out and being rolled out and being figured. They're probably figuring out how to regulate that as well. But we found a trusted organization to train with, and so I know that there's high ethics, high safety, all those pieces. Would you add anything to that, Hannah?
Yeah, the training piece is so important. And I also have been finding it a little bit harder. And that's just because psychedelics are such a like non-Western, non-capitalistic, put it in a pretty little bow by nature of what the hell it is. Sorry if I can't
No,
say
you're
that.
good. No, you're good.
But and we're trying to fit that into the 50-minute sessions and the 90837.
Mm,
So I, as a business owner, have found it extremely tricky to try to navigate that. um and I am an activist, and I think that all drugs, including psychedelics, should be legalized. And I think that's where perhaps I would lean on more of a harm reduction approach with the client. If
mm,
really like finances were a barrier, unfortunately, like we're not able to help you, but I do know some people in my community that would be
mm,
able, that are safe, that could do it in a more ceremonial context or in a group context, right? So I think it's also just about building a trusted network to lean on in this space. But I think it's really tricky to put it into the Western medical model when it is like completely opposite of that just by nature of what it is. But we're doing it, and we are westernizing it. So we'll see how it goes. But I think that's part of the challenge here for us.
And how do you like keep the, because I know there's been a huge discussion of like with the native healers saying like, talk to us, ask us, all those different things in Western medicine. I mean, I think it's just a really interesting crossroads. How do you, bring in like these Western models? When I say Western models, a lot of our therapy comes from like Europe and other places, but you bring in these therapy models and then these like holistic natural healing. How do you kind of put them together, right? And keep it from being super like Western therapy kind of stuff.
I think it's having a clinical approach and also recognizing like am not a shaman. I'm not a spiritual healer. I don't even consider myself a psychedelic facilitator. I'm a psychedelic therapist. I am
Mm,
trained from a Western model.
mm,
That doesn't mean, I sit there and we just like talk about problems. I'm still providing an experience, but I lean on what I know best, which is attachment research, trauma research, therapeutic intervention. So I don't typically go to the spiritual realm because I just don't think that's my place.
mhm.
I don't think that's in my wheelhouse. I lean on what I know, which is
Mhm.
using it in a therapeutic setting.
Right on. And what I'm hearing in that is healing occurs there.
Oh yeah,
Right
totally.
on.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Okay. Do you in that world? Because I think that's something you think about too. Like if you don't have that experience, no healing can occur. And then other people are like, you can microdose and then you're
Yeah.
healed. What do you see within these sessions? Right? Is it people do one and they're good? Is it
Yeah.
numerous different sessions? I know there's a lot of discussion on models. Like what are you seeing? You both of you guys out there in the business world.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on what the person's goal is. There are some clients that simply want to feel less depressed during the day, and that's where I would recommend that they microdose psilocybin and go see their therapist once or twice a week, or once
Mm,
twice a month, once a week. And then there are clients, like I said several times, work with couples. They're coming in for extensive, intensive attachment based interventions with me, where we're doing 3 nights of medicine, really just to focus on their relationship. So I really think that all roads lead to Rome. I think like depending on what your goals are, I'm all pro someone just going and getting their symptoms reduced if that's what they need. And
mhm,
then knowing that like if you have attachment trauma or you have intimacy related issues, like working that out with a therapist and someone who's experienced working with couples. But I think it just depends on, it's not a one size fits all approach. It really depends on what each person is working towards. And I do think that's a little bit of a place we need to work on in the psychedelic community. Is I think we're painting it with a big brush, saying that this is for everyone and it will heal
Mm.
everything and all you
mm,
have to do is do psychedelics. And I think it's much more nuanced than that. And so I think we've got to really educate people and help people understand what really are these different medicines, how are they used, in what context, and why.
mm. That's powerful. Like what context and why? I like that because I think that's something that's really important because a lot of people, especially like as the med provider, you get to these places where like you've went through the medicines and they're not working, and then they're, we now say they're treatment resistant, right?
Yes.
And then, they're not able to maintain the diet and do the supplementation and the different things. And so you're kind of just banging your head a little bit. And so then it's just like, well, just go try psychedelics. But it
Mhm.
has way more to do with like the context and what that looks like and what they need. And so most healers, I guess, kind of help clients navigate that world. Like, what do you think they need? Or is it like, hey, I know that this one, plant medicine is the medicine that I use?
I mean, I think it depends, right? And the practice that
Mhm.
I have and the therapist that I've trained, and I work closely with a group of therapists here in Colorado to train other therapists in this. That's our lens, right? We take a therapeutic lens where we're not so much focused on what type of medicine and what dose, but what's the therapy experience and what's that like. I know there are other programs out there that blast people with psychedelics, and
Mm,
that is their lens. I think it really depends on what it is someone is background in. I just really struggle with go do psychedelics with no support or education, because I think what it does is it sets up these false expectations, and gets really, I think, can be dangerous for people if they're kind of on the last step and it doesn't
mhm,
work. Well, what does it mean if it doesn't work? Because a lot of
mm,
times psychedelics are not a pleasant experience. You're not
yeah,
walking out of there like on cloud nine. It is an upheaval, it is a reprocessing. And so, really educating folks on what this actually means and how it actually works, I think, is really important versus, we should just blast the water stream with psychedelics and everything will be better. Well, I don't think that's true, right?
right on.
And don't you think, Hannah, there's an integration piece that I've heard you talk about a lot. Like there's a post, if you've done your psychedelics, you've done like half the work. Like the
Mhm.
rest of the work is the integration, understanding it, pulling it in. I have done ceremony psychedelics and I have done psychedelics. I've done ketamine with my own therapist, right? And I would say for both of those situations, um, it doesn't I want to pull it through, right? I want to
Yeah.
pull it through to the rest of my life and really integrate the information and integrate the experience. And I think you really miss out if you don't have the follow up and the secondary piece. So a lot of these people who are going and saying, doing my ayahuasca or and I'm doing my mushroom journey and all of those things, I have no issue with that and I'm for that. And um, there's such a deeper level of healing and connection that you can get if you do the rest of the work, the follow up.
Mm.
100%.
And I think what's interesting about that too is that you're talking about before, just like Western culture and all those different things. And I think we have such a tendency to just like want to make everything like the one pill fix all. And
Yep.
and that is definitely not this, right? Like
Mhm.
there
Yeah.
is so much work that goes into it that it's not like, hey, take this one medicine once a day or twice a day, and then like all of a sudden 4 weeks from now you're going to be better. Like there is a lot of work that goes into navigating that world as a client and a provider.
100%.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of responsibility on us and providers, and there should be, because
Mm.
I think you're taking someone into brand new territory. And, I'll be honest that like there have definitely been times looking back that I wish I didn't do psychedelic medicine with a client, right?
Mm,
But you have to recognize that you are really responsible here if you're guiding a client to this place. And I think part of it goes back to what Jane said. You have to do your own work. Like there's therapists out here doing psychedelic work that have never done a psychedelic. And I'm like, you need to know what the hell land your territory you're taking a client into. And I
mm,
think a therapist who is pro harm reduction, pro psychedelics, has done their own work, ask them. If you want to work with a
mm.
psychedelic therapist, ask them how they've been trained and if they work with the medicine themselves, because I think that's such an important thing too.
Man, that's such a great point, especially as you guys find yourself like on this emergence of a treatment model that's going to kind of just be there, right? And so like everybody's kind of applying, I guess, for licensures in different
Mhm.
places and how it's working.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
right on. So I think, for anyone that's like kind of listening to it, thinking about like, hey, I think about this kind of treatment, man, all this advice I think is huge because if not, you're going to end up somebody's basement somewhere dropping something from who knows what. It's got who knows what in it, or they don't have a good provider kind of guiding them that knows what they're doing.
Exactly. It's so, so, so important.
Yeah, right on. Thank you for
Mhm.
sharing that. That's great. And I think, to kind of bridge it together, how do you feel like psychedelics makes its way into that special population you guys are working with right? So now you guys find yourself with this new tool in your toolbox. Some of you already been doing it for now, but like as I'm hearing it, with this special population of all of these other demographic or all these other challenges, right? The social stuff, the biological stuff. How does it find a place in that world?
Well, for me, it really is all about the accessibility. So before, I was there doing actual psychedelic therapy, and a really good colleague of mine who's a ketamine provider, clients from the mountain communities at the time would have to drive 2 hours to Denver, and you
Mm,
can't drive on a psychedelic. So you've got to get a friend to take off work and drive you. So for me, it's really about bringing this healing to more isolated communities that really need the help and need the support, but bringing it to them without having the additional barriers of how do I get down to Denver? How do I get a ride? What do we do if it snows? I think really that accessibility piece is key.
Do
anything
you
you like
think,
to, yeah.
Hannah? Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
I was gonna say anything you want to throw in there, Jane? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask actually, Hannah, do you feel like people in Summit County are more open to psychedelics than they are like down in Denver? Or do you think people tend to be more open to that kind of work in bigger cities? Or do you not really know?
I mean, I hear all kinds of stuff. Like I definitely think most clients that I work with have heard of psychedelics or are interested or at least like want to know more. So I think people are really open to it in Denver and Summit County.
Mm,
I think the tricky part is I just think how it's portrayed in the mainstream media is inaccurate.
mm,
And so I think it's about getting like real good information rather than exactly kind of what we're saying. Go do this and you'll be healed. It's 20 years of
mm,
therapy in an afternoon. I think that's the hard part is actual
mm,
Yeah.
education
mm.
about what it really is and why it works.
I think that's very insightful. And I think it's really interesting too, kind of talking about like the difference between a small town and a big city. Like even here in the South, right, which is notoriously behind in so many different things, you've seen this emergence of people like that you
Mm,
never would think be asking about this as a treatment, coming into the office and being like, "What do you think about this?" And you're like,
mm.
interesting, right? And I think that when suffering outweighs whatever you're doing,
Yeah,
right? Anything kind of becomes an option, and that, I mean
totally.
that's how addiction works, right? But like I think that's how these new treatments kind of enter the market. And I think that's
Mhm.
something that's really important too. I know we're getting short on time. I'd love to ask you guys though, like moving outside of the mountain town world and just it's for someone who like lives in a traveler town too, what do you feel like are the most important things outside of a community, right, that you've got to do to navigate these like evolving, changing concepts of like a traveler town?
Hmm. I actually think personally they're the same advice as I would give clients in a non-traveling town. I think
Mm,
that there's just like a basic level of mental health that we need to pay attention to and work on
mm,
to sustain these different kinds of places that we live in. Hannah and I, our podcast is called Are We Happy Yet? And we focus a lot on like why are mental health like why is our mental health overall declining? How is
mm,
that? We're talking about it more, we're engaging with it more. There's
mm,
psychedelics, there's new practices, all of these pieces. So I think we're pretty curious about like what is actually working and what is not actually
mm,
working. Maybe to piggyback on something you guys were talking about earlier, I'm kind of like a throw everything at it. I am like, you cannot come to me once a week and feel better. I mean, you can try. I will try. I will give
mm,
you my all for that hour, but I'm like, your therapy and your medicines if you need them and your supplements and your friendships and your community and a lot of things that I think used to be baked into human life for the majority of our existence, which was like humanity and peace and calm and a long night's sleep and living with the seasons and just sort of a different kind of connection and rooted spirituality or rooted sort of sense of uh, connection to the earth. I mean, the way we live now is so brand new. And so the things we need aren't baked in. And that's how I talk to my clients about it. I'm like, the reason why it feels like so much work to keep your mental health up these days is because it is. Like,
mm,
it's hard for me to socialize enough and see my family enough and get enough rest and make enough art and read enough books, all the thing, get to my therapy enough. Um, it's not as natural in the rhythms of our life. So that's not really a solution, I guess, as much as just a way to think about it and sort of conceptualize it.
Yeah, I mean, that is so powerful. I love how you kind of talked about it's not baked into life. I think that, you see so many people, gosh, I've even been there in my own life of like, you can try to biohack your way to like thriving, but ultimately
Yeah.
when those things are missing, there's nothing you can do to match your connection with nature. Nothing. Like, I
Mm.
don't care what you can take all the supplements in the world, but if you're not getting outside and getting some sunshine, like it's just not happening, right? Like you just can't do it. There's nothing you
Totally.
can do to replicate human interaction of being part of a community. Like there's a supplement that can
Mm-mm.
do that. There's nothing that can do that. And so I think there is something like you said that for many times throughout history we've had it baked into life and now it's not. And so then what do you do with that? How do you navigate that world? That's so interesting.
Especially when the culture is like, this is normal. You should be
Mm,
adjusting to how it is because this is
yeah.
life and you have everything you need. So why do you have a problem? Um, and we're like, wait, do we have everything that we need in a very
Mm,
wealthy country? And of course, with lots of disparity and lots of
mm,
wealth gaps. But
mm.
um, yeah, I think the cultural narrative is this is normal and this is fine. There's nothing to see
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. And so it's almost it's like going back to the store and getting the things that need to be baked in
Hmm.
to survive. Right on.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, Hannah, to that?
No, I think that's right on. And just like, yeah, I think too, it is the culture. And just, I think the culture and social media and comparison just makes people feel like they're wrong and bad and broken for what is actually normal and part of being a human, especially in 2025. And so I know you said our answer couldn't be community. So I'll try to trick you and go a roundabout way, but you have to be able to engage in your real life and not a life on the social media or the phone or
Mm.
right. You have to be able to like be engaged in a real life. Um, so you're grounded in something, right?
Man, I think that, yeah, and it is funny you bring up because I think to a point, like we say it over and over as clinicians, right? And I think to a point people kind of glaze over, but like we can't understate how powerful it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think so many times, like everybody's just looking for the one thing, right? The right diet, the right stuff. And it's like, what would it look like just to connect with two people
Hmm.
and find like some place to like go help some people who are hurting in your community or whatever that looks like, right? Like that is so powerful. So for our listeners, how can they follow the work you guys are doing? I mean, you're in Summit County, you're in the other areas around that. Like, how can people follow the work you guys are doing, spearheading some of this?
I think the best place is our podcast. We have really similar conversations to this one every week. It's called Are We Happy Yet? Jane and I both co-host that and have different guests that have these really important conversations. So I'd say find us there. My practice is Alchemy Therapy and Wellness. We are in Summit County, Denver, and we also have our show on the road these days. So we're taking the
Nice.
psychedelic work to different areas to be able to do it in an intensive format. So if you're interested in that, me or my team could help you. And Jane, you can share about your practice.
Yeah, my practice is called Grit Therapy. We're just at grittherapy.com and we are in Summit and slowly expanding down to Denver. And like I said, we have a range of clinicians that serve a range of people in different populations and different needs. So you can find us online and reach out anytime.
Right on. And I'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well. Not only the podcast, but then all the work you guys are doing. Hannah, Jane, thank you so much for being with me today. This was like an incredible conversation. I could do this conversation for hours and just kind of
So
listen to you
fun.
guys talk. I know you guys are like, we got a strict time. And I'm like, you sure you got another 10 minutes,
Well,
right?
listen, we're always welcome. We're always happy to come back.
Yeah.
Right on, right on.
Anytime.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing your
Thank
knowledge and
you.
your wisdom and all those things. Man, thank you so much.
This was really fun. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.